All right, folks, let's check out the 1990s for a minute here. The 1990s was the greatest blossom, you could say full blossom of the music business under the models that were in place at that time. Those models were largely exploded by what's referred to as P2P file sharing, which is basically what happens when you combine an easy to transmit form of a recording, so in this case an MP3, with a global communications network, the internet, and then a lack of security that's written into the computer program. And so it's kind of like you have, imagine a huge concert with the gates that are secured and a fence all around it. Well, P2P file sharing is essentially, a bulldozer coming in and knocking down those gates, and then you've got free, movement across that's not monetized. And so that's kind of what ended up happening. But at the end of the 90s, but before that, it had reached a sort of zenith. And so that's what this is going to, get into a little bit. The way I like to show the importance or what happens in this fullest elaboration of growth is to look at what happens to genre and what a broad representation there is in terms of gender and ethnicity and things like that. So all areas of the music business, relatively healthy. Here are a few vocab terms that some of which you remember already, like revivalism, some of which you'll get a sense of when we're talking here today, like alternative genres and narrowcasting. So as I mentioned, 1990s was a high point of the music business. Record sales alone were in the area of $14 billion in 1999. They went down to about half of that within 3 years later because of what I mentioned before. All of the traditional three streams of the music business, the sound recordings, which is Circle P, live sales, tickets, and money from songwriting, altogether totaled less than $14 billion in 2016. So it's just to give you an idea of the deflation of the music business that happened. And so what we find in terms of genre is that you have an increase of the amount of genres in the mainstream as the ones that are sort of heritage genres like rock or country, will splinter into other genres. And it just kind of grows out like that to some extent. So some of the genres that had been marginal before came in to the mainstream. There are completely new genres, and there was even revival of obsolete genres. So we can identify 9 different markets, 9 different genres with mainstream level sales in the 1990s. And so you can go down the list and see, Janet Jackson with adult contemporary, Garth Brooks, then alternative, several different alternative genres, heavy metal, revival, soundtrack, which is typically, that's typically a genre that requires a huge blockbuster to get into mainstream level sales. And so that's what they had with the Titanic. So it was like a perfect sort of storm in the 1990s. You see a healthy representation of women, as you can imagine, from Latina women all the way across to alternative folk like Annie DeFranco and Alanis Morissette, African American women, country singers. Um, Whitney Houston with $200 million in record sales income worldwide is that's way up there. You'll see shortly, um, some other figures to compare that with. I do have a sort of look at her breakthrough, Nasty Boys, and then 10 years later, what's she doing? What does she look like? What kind of videos is she doing? It's much more self-referential, like in terms of who she is, and the earlier one, it's just kind of this is what she does, and she's doing her thing. It's so you can see kind of the impact of this, of success on psychology. That second video, you can see that she's in a more sort of adult situation with friends in the house in the evening and kind of having wine with friends versus just the righteous kind of out of control dancing and carrying on in the earlier one. But there is a psychological impact to her success as well, and she is caught up with her own image in a way that is underplayed, at least in the first video. So you see Queen Latifah with 2 million in record sales. Salt and Pepper with 15 million. Lauryn Hill with 16 million. And on down the line, Leanne Rimes, Shania Twain, Gloria Estefan. High water mark there for her at 100 million, but still just half of what we saw with Whitney Houston. So she had a very compelling voice and very compelling presence across the mainstream. So like I said, heritage genres like country music would be diversifying. So you've got sort of the core of country music in the 1990s represented, of course, by Garth Brooks. So that's 160 million. Second to the Beatles in the U.S. with 177 million. And let's see, Toby Keith, George Strait. Here's a recording of George Strait. There those three are. So they're sort of carrying the mantle. I just have this. This kind of makes me, I don't know, giggle a little bit because you can tell how far we are from this time period. So the mullet is hanging on. I shouldn't make light, but the sort of idealized version of cowboy life, is set forth here in this video, and it's an interesting image, the way that it's shot in sepia tone, like it's old, and so the core is hanging on to the kind of the imaginary Old West, at least in this video, lifestyle, whereas splinter genre like alternative country is represented by artists like Lyle Lovett, who married famous actress Julia Roberts shortly there in the 90s, so it was a high water mark for him. And he was doing, these guys were mixing genres kind of like Elvis had. Dwight Yoakam mixing classic rock, punk, and country. Lyle Lovett with a little bit more gospel and blues. But you can see their success. Dwight Yoakam made it into some films like Sling Blade in 1996. Lovett had 4 Grammys along with some film and television opportunities of his own. And then you've got sort of the edgier, more rambunctious artists like Hank Williams III and Drive-By Truckers, who are pictured over here. on the bottom right. So an interesting look at the some of the eye-popping numbers that the 1990s are generating with some of the top-level stars across a broad swath of genres. Seems to be ever increasing and amplifying. And so it does make you wonder if the reorganization was a necessary thing. Had it gotten too big? That's a question, a philosophical question for you to consider. All right, we'll catch up with a little bit more in the 1990s here shortly. Enjoy yourselves. Have a good evening.